Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, listener, to episode 76 of the Ad Nauseam podcast. As always, my name is Dr. David C. Noe, and I'm here in the vomitorium with my good friend and fabulous co-host, Dr. Jeffrey T. Winkle. How are you, Jeff?
I'm feeling good today. Excited about this episode.
This is going to be a special one, isn't it?
It is. Yep.
Whom do we have with us here in the studio today?
We have our good friend and former colleague, mentor, travel companion, Dr. Ken Bratt.
Teacher, advisor, so many titles.
The list goes on and on and on.
Right. Yep. Now, Ken has been here before. He is, in fact, the first guest to make a repeat appearance.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
And when was he here before?
He was here, I think, last summer.
Yes.
Talking to us about the archaeology at Philippi.
That's right.
Yep.
And a similar topic today. It's going to be on the catacombs around Rome.
Yes. Yeah. Before we get into the weeds, let's do our shout out for today.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll start that out. This
Please.
goes to Daniel Turnquist. Daniel says, Chyrita, Dave, and Jeff. This is the first, isn't it, Jeff?
The first Chyrita?
The first one we've gotten.
That's right.
Yeah. So
much appreciated.
Yeah, and it came just in the nick of time.
Today.
We use a little bit of Greek here. And chropeophthalmou. Ooh, in the blink of an eye.
Nice.
Daniel says, I'm a senior majoring in computer science at the University of Minnesota. We got to stop right there.
Why do we allow computer scientists?
Computer scientists? I know, it's breaking the code.
But keep reading. I think this is where it gets good.
He said, I minored in ancient Greek at the University of Minnesota. I first came across the podcast on the Classics subreddit under a post asking for good classics podcasts where, for some reason, listen to that, sarcasm, ad nauseum was mentioned.
I like the tone. The tone, yeah.
He says, I've been consuming this thing for about 3 months, and I've managed to choke down every single episode.
Okay, he's onto it.
Yeah, so make of that what you will, he says. You want to continue?
Yeah, so he wants to give a shout-out of his own within his own shout-out to his excellent Greek professors. He'd like to thank Anthony Thomas, Douglas Olson, and Nita Crevens for enabling me to enjoy some of the finest literature out there and for giving me a lot of background to better enjoy this very podcast.
Oh, yeah, that's nice. It's nice when professors get appreciated.
It is. And I admire these people out there that do they kind of have the two sides. They choose to major in. You got the scientists, you got your more techie, kind of your black and white major, and then they balance it out with something in the humanities. I think that's really admirable.
There's a famous economist, Nicholas Nassim Taleb. He wrote Skin in the Game and Black Swan and those kinds of books. He says everyone should do something old and useless. We've got that covered, right?
Yes, that's our sweet spot.
Yeah, and something new and useful. I think that's really good advice.
It is very good advice.
And that's what Daniel's doing.
I like that.
He also included both a PS and a PPS.
Are we gonna, it's getting a little long, Daniel.
Well, we'll just cover the PS.
All right.
He says, I may just join the Lingua Latina per se Illustrata class once my university studies are done. This whole podcast, I've been thinking, man, this Moss method thing sounds great, but I've already completed my minor. That's my Daniel voice. What I really want is to get my Latin off the ground, and it seems that my prayers have not gone unheard.
All right, well, he needs to change the may just to definitely will.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, sounds great. Well, thank you, Daniel, for writing it. He also gave us some really nice suggestions for episodes that he'd like to hear.
He did. You think we'll ever cover those, or we'll just take them in and keep them down?
He requested one on Lucian. So this is my guy.
Samosata, right?
Yeah, he wants us to do a true story. So some of that,
okay,
early science fiction stuff. It's great. Okay. It's a great idea.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much.
Right. So, Dave, we're talking about the catacombs today.
Yes, we are.
And we brought in Ken, who's our expert on kind of all things archaeological.
That's right.
Particularly when it comes to kind of the history of early Christianity.
Yes, material culture. He knows it, from vases to statues to cores, the whole 9 yards.
Yep.
He's the go-to guy.
Yeah.
So you have the opening quote this week, right?
I do. It's kind of off our usual beaten track. Usually we have something from an academic journal or a book chapter on some expert, and so I was looking around in my own books and not finding anything that I liked, and so I did some searching, and I found this bleak poem.
It's quite bleak.
It is quite bleak, and I don't know anything about the poet or the background, but I found this poem by a certain John Weinberg, who wrote in 1987. This is the short poem called "The Catacombs of St. Callistus," and it goes like this: Who then lives in the sandstone, crammed between the spore of earth and air? No one here to sing your dead to sleep. And we were fooled, friend, to believe that dying was like treading the wind. Who then set the spark to the lightning bolt? allowed the slim aspen to tremble. Come, let's walk the stairs, past the axe scar at the back of the skull, past the pulse fluttering in your neck. The crows outside are outliving the branches. The world is cold and sad. It's not time yet to change clothes with the dead. They can feed themselves.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's kind of quite gruesome.
It is kind of
isn't
gruesome, right? You know, I'm drawn to my love of
I know.
The urban legends and horror films.
Liminality, Memento Mori, the whole 9 yards.
I like the uncanny, the weird.
Yes.
But I like that. Come, let's walk the stairs. That's what we're doing. We're going to walk down those stairs into those catacombs and see what we find.
Yeah, the most recent time that I visited the catacombs, very briefly, my fellow tour guide, she could not go down in there. It was just too. I mean, not the Italian tour guide, the other person I was traveling with.
Oh, really?
Wonderful individual. I won't mention her name, but there was no way she was going to go down there. Too creepy, too feeling of enclosed and trapped.
Oh, it's very claustrophobic down
Absolutely.
there. Right? And very easy to, if you go off the trail, very easy to get lost.
That's right. It's a labyrinth of sorts.
Yeah.
All right, so what are we going to give the listener, the viewer today? A direct look through the eyes of an expert at the construction, the history of the catacombs, the occupants of the catacombs, some of the early art and the meaning, and a little bit, I think, from the situation and the circumstances of them today, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get right into it.
All right, so we're going to look at, we'll see how this goes. We hope to look at two specific sets of catacombs, the St. Callistus and St. Sebastian. But I wanted to start, Ken, with just some kind of general questions. If you could tell us about, what makes the catacombs different than kind of another typical, Roman burial site? What does the word even mean? Where do we find them? Could you start us there?
Sure. They're found in a lot of places, including Paris and so on. But if we think just of Rome, these are burial grounds underground, outside the city walls, because it was illegal for the Romans to bury within the walls during the classical period. The term itself, Catacombs, comes from the Greek for near the hollows or the pits. And this derives from the fact that the Catacomb of San Sebastian, in particular, originated in sand mines south of the city walls, which were then abandoned and turned into a cemetery. Originally, it was a pagan cemetery, and when they needed more room, they began tunneling through the tufa, the volcanic rock, which underlies much of Rome. This tufa is easily excavated, so it was an easy kind of cemetery to construct. Once the rock is excavated, it also turns relatively hard, and consequently it's structurally firm. And you can bury a lot of people along the side walls of a long tunnel. When you run out of space, you just dig the tunnel deeper, and this tended to be the mode of construction.
Now, when you look at it like I've looked on, online, you find the maps of the tunnels of the catacombs. It doesn't look to me like there's a lot of plan to it, but was it just kind of ad hoc? They just kind of built on as needed and just dug in one particular direction?
Right. They developed sort of helter-skelter. I have read that Roman law required the catacombs to be constructed beneath the same property lines that governed spaces on the surface. And there are, in fact, records of deeds and ownership for underground cemeteries. So within certain limits, they could move off in various directions. And of course, you could also go deeper. So in the Catacombs of Callisto, for example, there are 5 levels going down as deep as 90 feet. The first level only about 20 feet down. And they spread, as you say, in every direction. Sometimes they reconnect with old passages. Many of them originated in underground chambers for family tombs, which were then subsequently linked to the tunnels that allowed for access to more and more burials. And it's estimated that the 50 catacomb complexes which have so far been found in the region of Rome ultimately held some 5 million burials.
Oh, my.
Wow. I don't know precisely how these numbers were calculated, but just to take the Catacomb of Callisto, one can measure the tunnels alone, and they reach something like 10 miles in length. And of course, there's very compressed space along these tunnels in which every surface of the wall has been fitted with horizontal cuts,
Okay.
loculi, as the Romans called them,
Right.
in which the dead were actually buried.
So a loculus is like a drawer, actually, is a common term
In
for a
effect, it
drawer.
is.
So
Yeah, sealed by either a marble plaque or a ceramic plaque in the case of the more modest tombs.
Right. Now, did the Romans engage in cremation, or was it all inhumation?
Well, pagan Rome practiced cremation until the second century after Christ, in which during the Hadrianic period, the carving of above ground, the carving of lavish sarcophagi came into vogue, especially among the rich. And so from the second century on, mixed burial practices of cremation in urns and burial in large fancy sarcophagi were practiced by pagans. Jews and Christians, on the other hand, did not cremate their dead normally, and from the beginning favored a simple burial in which the corpse was wrapped in a cloth and deposited in the earth rapidly after death. And so the Jewish catacombs and the Christian catacombs have no burial urns. They do have some sarcophagi, but for the most part, the burials take the form of the loculus, the horizontal slot in the side wall, or the arcosolium, a somewhat arched space into which the burial was made for fancier purposes. There are also some tombs that are known as Mensa Tombs, in which the burial was laid under a table of sorts, and we could talk more about how that table was used. And so they come in a variety of forms, but Christian and Jewish tombs are full inhumations.
And does that relate to kind of beliefs about the resurrection of the body at the end times? You want your body to be at least somewhat intact?
It certainly does on the Jewish side,
okay.
And I think it does on the Christian side too. David knows more about the literary evidence for these things than I, but no doubt there's a theological impulse behind the inhumation of the body.
Right.
And it's interesting, too, that the Christians tended to bury their bodies in communal cemeteries, in contrast with the pagan practice, which typically had been conducted on the surface along the main roads out of town, like the Via Appia, where family tombs are the dominant form of burial. And the family tombs become more and more elaborate in order to advertise the wealth and the power of the clan.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that one of the first impacts of Christianity in terms of burial was to disrupt family bonds and redefine the family more in terms of the Christian community with which you were associated?
Yeah.
By the 3rd century, yes. I would hesitate to draw that conclusion from the 1st or 2nd because we really don't have good evidence about Christian burial until about the year 200. But from that point on, yes, the Roman Church specifically set aside the Catacomb of San Callisto for ecclesiastical burial. And although some chambers in the catacombs would be presumably set aside for families who wanted their dead to be buried together, the catacombs at large comprise rich and poor and members of all kinds.
So we've talked a little bit about the association with Christians being buried rather than being cremated, but what about the legends of them worshiping in the catacombs? Is that just an artifact of Hollywood, or is there a basis for it?
Yeah, it's entirely fictitious. There were certainly ceremonies in the catacombs. For example, at the funeral itself, people would be present. Some of the chambers are capable of holding 20, 30, 40 people, but the vast majority of the burials are in very tight space, poorly lit, poorly ventilated. One can only imagine what the decay of hundreds of bodies would have contributed to these locations in the worst of times.
Yeah.
And you guys have been there. This is not a suitable atmosphere for any kind of crowd to gather, much less in worship.
Right.
You can't have a cookie and a cup of coffee after the service down there.
No, although this gets me back to those tables. Many of the chambers that were large enough to accommodate 15, 20 people have tables in them. And the general interpretation of these architectural forms is that families would gather on anniversaries of the dead to celebrate a ceremony. Some people think it was the ceremony known as the Refrigerium, the Refreshment feast, in which food would be shared with the dead, symbolically.
Like a Jell-O salad, maybe, with some grapes suspended in between?
We mustn't go there, David.
Well, it reminds me a lot of like the Mexican Day of the Dead. You put out a feast for your dead
Ancestor
relatives,
worship, of course, was a common practice in the
course.
pagan world, and Christians were not resistant to carrying over some of those traditions even into their practice.
Yeah, my sense is that a lot of those legends of persecution come from like the novels and the films like Ben Hur, right?
Quo Vadis.
Quo Vadis. Like even in the novel Ben Hur, Judah Ben Hur and his wife are said to have established the Catacombs of San Callisto.
Yeah.
Right. So,
and there's a scene in there in which I think Peter is preaching to a crowd of what looks like 150 people, beautifully lit.
Yes, it's true. Yes, exactly.
Inside the catacombs.
Inside the catacombs.
Well, it's funny, when I teach in class, I talk about Nero, and I ask students, do you know anything about Nero? And one of the things I'll still hear is he goes, "Oh, he's the guy who threw the Christians to the lions in the Colosseum," which of course was built long after his death.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so these legends are still have
they're alive.
a foothold. Yeah.
And the catacombs, going back to that myth about Judah Ben Hur founding them, were not founded in the 1st century.
Right.
The very earliest cemeteries may date to that period, but the catacombs themselves date largely to the 3rd and 4th. So the heyday of their construction was in the 3rd and 4th centuries.
At a time.
Go ahead.
At a time when, at least under Constantine, it was safe to be a Christian.
Yes.
Right.
And the churches were developing above ground with perfect security.
Do you happen to know in terms of cremation versus inhumation, if that flip comes for the emperors too? Because I know Trajan was cremated, Hadrian was cremated, but I confess I don't know anything about the burial of Constantine. Was he?
Constantine was buried intact.
He was,
and his family, and the sarcophagi, which are porphyry, are now in the Vatican Museum. The one with the military scene on it was used for his mother, Helena, but was, most scholars believe, created for Constantine himself.
Oh, okay.
He was buried in Constantinople, of course.
Right.
In a circular shrine, which no longer exists, surrounded by cenotaphs for the 11 apostles, the 12 apostles, and Constantine in the center, like the 13th.
He's the 5th beetle.
Yeah.
The successor of the disciples.
Wasn't or isn't his mother buried in that church near the Capitoline Hill?
Yeah, Santa Elena.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And his daughter, Constantia as she was known then, her tomb is fully preserved with another porphyry sarcophagus, very beautiful, with vine tendrils on its external.
But Constantine's tomb is lost?
Constantine's sarcophagus may survive in the one that was used for his mother.
Okay.
But yes, his tomb is lost.
His body is lost. Yeah. Okay.
The site on which the holy apostles once stood in Istanbul is now dominated by one of the great mosques.
Okay. Right.
So to change directions a little bit, you were saying earlier as many as 5 million individuals may have been buried. This is the calculation, but where did all of the bodies go?
Well, some of them are still there, decayed, of course. The bones are still in many of the tombs, and those who have walked through a lot of the corridors will have seen skulls and femurs and the like. But the main answer is that the popes first removed most of these relics to urban churches in the 6th and 7th centuries, starting with the martyrs. When the cult of the martyrs began to flourish in the late 4th and 5th century, the relics of the martyrs were transported into urban churches. Often churches were built on the sites of these tombs as well. And so a lot of translation occurred. The relics were taken from the catacombs into the city. In fact, probably the biggest repository of remains is beneath the floor of the Pantheon. Wagon loads of bodies were emptied from the catacombs and brought into the city when the Pantheon was converted into the Church of the Martyrs, which is how it got its name.
So the floor was removed, pieces of the floor were removed, and the bones were established there and then covered back up.
And another church, Santa Prasseda, which is near Santa Maggiore, is also the repository of thousands of burials from the catacombs. There was in the late 8th and early 9th century, there were threats from Gothic and Lombard invaders which prompted the popes to move a lot of bones inside the city walls, in part for reasons of security. And so the long answer is that the bodies are, to some degree, preserved, but they've been relocated. And then, of course, we have to remember that pilgrims swarmed into Rome during these centuries and made off with pieces of the remains as far as possible.
Yes, everyone got a piece of the Apostle Peter, presumably.
Well, even some of these relics were, of course, they were divided up too, right? So you have some churches have like the finger of so-and-so, right?
Right. Yeah. So the heads of Peter and Paul, for example, are allegedly in San Giovanni in Lateran, the St. John in Lateran.
That's right.
Others of their remains presumably are in the churches which bear their names.
St. Paul outside the walls, right?
Yeah.
And the Vatican.
Right. All right, so let's turn to our first set of specific catacombs. Let's talk about the Catacombs of San Callisto. But before we dive into that, just curious, Ken, do you have a favorite catacombs that you've been to?
Well, I have a couple of favorites because of the circumstances in which I first visited them.
Okay.
But I love them all. I love Santa Priscilla Catacombs because it's the one where you get tour guides who are nuns.
Oh.
All the others are priests.
And do you find the nuns more
the nuns
knowledgeable, more
really,
pleasant?
I find them very cheerful.
Okay.
And I should say the Catacombs of Priscilla are also among the oldest and have some of the most beautiful artistic pieces.
Okay.
The other one I would mention is an obscure one called the Catacomb of now I'm forgetting.
That's okay.
Pancratius, which is on the Janiculum, not too far from the Vatican. And I discovered it by accident. It was perfectly open, no tours. You just wander into it from the church of the same name. And it had tombs that were wide open with bodies still in them in some cases, or remains. And so it was those occasions that just made those favorites for me.
Right.
Gotcha.
Right.
Of the two we're talking about today, do you have one that you prefer?
Yeah, San Callisto, of course, is much bigger and much richer. San Sebastiano has a tour that's very limited, so you only get about 15 minutes in the catacomb, and you don't see some of the key things that you would like to see.
Right.
Whereas San Callisto has tours that go, depending on the season of the year, long or short tours that go into many different areas of the complex.
Gotcha.
So this one, Callisto, named after Pope Calixtus the First.
Right.
3rd century, so 280s, something like
217.
that? 217.
Early. Okay.
Well, he was a deacon at the time. He was assigned to organize and administer this cemetery on behalf of Pope Zephyrinus, who was in office at that time. And by the way, the word pope doesn't come into use until the 4th century, so I guess to be precise, we should call him bishop.
Yeah, episcopus.
Bishop.
Right.
At any rate, it's named for him. He became the pope later, the Bishop of Rome, and he suffered martyrdom as well. Ironically, he's not even buried in his own catacomb. But the complex is named for him.
Okay.
Under whom did he die?
He died in... you mean under which emperor?
Under which emperor, yeah.
It was one of those 25 emperors who ruled between.
Yeah.
Oh.
Probably Valerius.
225 and 217. No, it was earlier than that. I think it was probably Balbinus or Maximinus Thrax or one of those guys who ruled for about a year before being assassinated.
Yeah. Right.
So this one is famous for the individuals that are buried there. Is that correct?
Yes. 16 popes or bishops of Rome are allegedly buried there. 5 original epitaphs of bishops of Rome have been found in one chamber, the so-called Crypt of the Popes. And that became a nucleus developed by a 4th century pope named Damasus as a major center of pilgrimage.
Okay.
So Callisto is partly famous because it was the official cemetery of the Roman Church. And by the 4th century, it had been developed and elaborated in order to attract pilgrims specifically. The first stairway built into the catacombs was apparently constructed by Damasus, and it's the same one you climb down today when you visit.
And we found there's a number of these like pilgrimage guides from the Middle Ages, right? That kind of tell you kind of where to go and what to see. right? And that goes. I mean, we did an episode on necropolis under St. Peter's, the Scavi.
Oh, good.
And there's that even that quote from I think Gaius that says, when you go there, make sure you stop at the Tropaeon of Peter and Paul. So that had been these sites as pilgrimages had been going on for quite some time, right?
Yeah. And you can still see graffiti from hundreds of pilgrims on the stairways and corridors, especially in the area of the Crypt of the Popes, which was certainly one of the most popular zones for pilgrims to live, to visit. There was even a guide to the pilgrimage churches of Rome, I think 7 of them, and one could evade certain kinds of penance by visiting all 7 pilgrimage churches.
Sure, right, yeah.
That would be convenient.
Well, it's that you see the similar kind of thing like with the Hajj, right? And it's by going through the stages of that pilgrimage, right? You have completed one of the necessary 5 pillars, right?
You're well outside my area of expertise. So you're talking about Islam requirements.
The Islamic
Islam?
pilgrimage, right? So
okay.
you're, if you're able to once in your life, you go to Mecca.
And needless to say, it had tremendous economic impacts on Rome. The attraction of pilgrims, especially on years of Jubilee, added a great deal of funds to the papal treasury.
Sure. And I think probably a lot of, and then like the relics themselves becomes big business, right? And to get a kind of a flood of forgeries and fakes.
Wow, and this was before 3D printing, right? So you had to make up all this stuff on your own.
Right.
So how many of the relics do you think, I'm sure you can't give a percentage, but do archaeologists think that some of the relics that were passed off were actually from animals or bones from creatures, and maybe just any available scrap that would be appealing to a pilgrim?
I can't answer that question.
Yeah. You're an academic. Speculate.
I'm not a biologist or an osteologist.
Okay.
I'm sure that question has been studied.
Yeah.
There's this myth that there are enough pieces of the true cross to compose a whole forest.
Right.
To build Noah's Ark.
Right.
But and the same may very well be true of many of the relics. But places that got distinguished relics immediately became centers of pilgrimage.
Right. And then centers of commerce as well, you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, to go to something that's a little more well secured, what are some of the early Christian symbols and images that populate these catacombs?
Well, that's another reason for which San Callisto is famous. It has an immense range of these images, both in sculptural form on the tombstones that survive in marble, and especially in fresco. So many of the chambers were frescoed and then painted. The tombs were concealed behind a surface of plaster, and over the tomb were painted not only generic scenes that had been drawn from the Roman tradition, like, for example, the Good Shepherd figure, which is an ancient classical image, the dove, the garden in which the people are praying, the orant, the praying figure with the hands raised, and so on and so forth, but also explicitly biblical narrative scenes. And so in some of the oldest paintings of the San Callisto catacombs, the 5 chambers of the sacraments, as they're known, we have images of Jesus' baptism, of Moses striking the rock, especially of Jonah, 3 episodes of Jonah thrown overboard, Jonah cast out by the sea monster on land, and Jonah reclining under a gourd. All of these have a typological significance for the Christians, in which images of biblical stories, and especially Old Testament, which outnumber the New Testament scenes by about 4 to 1, I'm told, are meant to signify deliverance from peril. And in the context of the tomb, of course, deliverance from death.
Right.
So there's a kind of soteriological and symbolic significance to the imagery used in these tombs. The Christians did not avoid iconography. They were not like the later iconoclasts of the Orthodox tradition. They favored artistic representations, some of which had been drawn directly from the classical traditions. And even the biblical narrative scenes often have the same stylistic qualities that contemporary non-Christian art showed. So one of the significances of San Callisto is that it is a repository of the earliest visible evidence of distinctively Christian art in these biblical narratives. And most of it is in fresco, but there are sculptural representations as well, very early sarcophagi, and especially relief sculpture on some of the epitaphs, the slabs that were used to seal the loculi.
So I've been thinking lately, and I'd like to be corrected here, the type or the motif of I think it's called the Boscophoros, is that right? The calf carrier, which is a common, I'm not sure I got that right, a common statue group where a man is shown carrying a calf on his shoulders?
There's one at the Acropolis Museum in Athens, which is very famous, a 6th century BC man bringing a calf to sacrifice. More common is Hermes carrying a ram or a sheep in some cases.
Were either of these adapted into a Christian context of the Savior, the shepherd carrying a lamb on his shoulders?
So there are numerous Roman scenes where a man is carrying a lamb. In the Christian context, clearly, this very symbol carries a new meaning.
Yes.
So the Christians, in a sense, impute a new meaning to a number of conventional symbols. The dove might be another one. The anchor might be one. The fish might be one.
The shell,
the branch, the garden tree. Birds are often employed for in classical art, possibly to represent the soul or the spirit of the dead. And often these come from the Roman funerary tradition straight into the Christian tradition. But what's new, of course, is that they're juxtaposed with biblical narratives.
Right.
And the biblical narratives are rendered in a very summistic form. That is, only the basic elements are there. Someone who does not know the narrative would not recognize what a scene of a man with hands up and 2 lions next to him would represent.
It's Daniel, obviously, right?
So in the context of such imagery, the shepherd image comes to have a new meaning. A Christological meaning, because Jesus himself identifies as the good shepherd.
So if you were a Roman artist and part of your business, your commerce was to create these kinds of images and small statues and so forth for your customers, and then a Christian comes along and says, I would like a couple of carved doves, or I would like a small Boscophoros or something, they probably wouldn't have said that. But you can pretty much use the same sort of material and repertoire, but Christians will impute to it a different kind of meaning. Is that safe to say?
Yes. And in fact, many scholars believe that the same workshops painted in the Christian catacombs as they were painting in other catacombs. So that you often have, presumably, some pagan artists who are at work decorating Christian burials.
And just to go back briefly to kind of these legends about early Christians, is there any truth of kind of the blending of Christian imagery with pagan imagery as a way of kind of like a secret code, right? As a way to kind of slip it past the censors, or
very unlikely. Because the ownership of these spaces was publicly recorded and known to everyone. In fact, closed at various times, like under the Emperor Valerian, who closed the catacombs to new burials. There was no way that these could be considered hidden. And if you know the identities of the people who are buried there, why would you have to be cryptic in your imagery?
You've been reading Dan Brown? Is that what it is?
Well, I mean, that's very Dan Browny, right? Yeah. But that's also in the stuff of these late 19th century novels, too.
Yes.
Now, on the other hand, it may not have been deliberately secretive, but it would not have been fully understood by a non-Christian because they would not know the narrative context or the meaning of revised imagery like the calf bearer or the lamb bearer.
And we don't see the symbol, the cross is much later. We don't see that.
Much later. Not until the 5th century do we have our earliest specific reference to the crucifixion.
But there is that famous cross with a donkey mounted upon it, right?
Yes.
Oh, yes, yeah.
On the Palatine. It's a graffito,
right?
Probably dating to the 3rd century, in which Alexander, I think is his name, reverences his it
says, you're worshiping your god, or something.
Your god,
right? So,
and it's the image of an ass on a cross.
Can he say that on this show? I think this is a family show.
We can bleep him out there.
Just kidding. Speaking of bleeping out,
yes,
it's time for the ads.
It is. This episode of Ad Nauseam brought to you by Hackett Publishing. Hackett Publishing, this is their 50th year?
50th year. Yeah, the golden anniversary, just like the Gophers.
Just the Gophers?
The Golden Gophers of Minnesota.
Oh, where Daniel comes from.
We're going back to the shout-out.
Yes, that's right.
So where are their offices? Cambridge, Massachusetts?
In Indianapolis, Indiana.
Yes.
They've been in the business of bringing affordable and approachable translations of the classics and many other corners of academia for all these many years. I love their stuff. Dave, tell us a little bit about Hackett.
Well, they have such a wide range of fantastic offerings, like you were saying. They've got translations, not just one in each category. The Metamorphoses, we've covered that on the air. They've got the Stanley Lombardo and the other one, which is just as good.
Yep.
Whose name I can't remember.
I got them both in my car right now. Yeah.
But then they've got the Iliad, the Odyssey. They have several editions of Aristotle. They've got Plato. Anything you could want, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You always like to talk about, and I agree, the lovely covers.
Oh, the great cover art.
Right.
That's one of my favorite
the
things.
Moon landing and
the D-Day the D-Day landing. Yes, exactly, for the Iliad. It's great stuff.
Yeah. So if a listener wants to patronize this podcast and get some great affordable translations and other kinds of things for themselves, what do they need to do?
They need to go to hackettpublishing.com. That's HACKETT publishing.com. Pick out your text, drop it in your little digital satchel thing.
We're going to go there again, talk about that?
We're going to leave it right there.
All right.
And then in the coupon code box, you type in AN2022, and that will get them what?
20% off, which by my calculation is about a fifth.
About a fifth.
And free shipping.
Free shipping too.
Yeah, and let's be honest, you cannot get that kind of a bargain at any other bookstore that I'm aware of.
You cannot.
It's phenomenal.
So check it out.
This episode is also brought to you by Racial Coffee. Racial Coffee of Portland, Oregon. Our good friend Mark Helweg has put together a fine coffee machine, both the Ratio 6 and the Ratio 8, that will solve all of your brew-based needs. Jeff, what do you like about the Ratio 6?
I got the Ratio 6 in my house. I love it's a sleek-looking machine. It's a work of art. It outclasses everything else on my kitchen counters.
Even the can opener?
The can opener is so embarrassed.
Especially the
can opener. Right. Exactly. The Cuisinart, there's no contest.
Just crawls away in terror, right?
It does. Every morning. But I press that button. It goes through its 3 stages.
We're going to review those?
Well, very quickly. The bloom.
Yes.
The brew.
Can I talk about the bloom for a minute?
Please do.
Well, let's not be too hasty.
Okay.
During the bloom, the hot water comes down through the metallic veins, sits in that cone, and then off gases, as you like to say, all of the harsh CO2.
Yes.
What are you left with as you move into the brew stage?
Well, then the brew, that's where the magic happens.
Okay, tell us about the magic,
That's
Dr.
where
Winkle.
the hot water goes through the cone, through the grounds, and into the weighted, heavy industrial carafe.
That's right. And it keeps it warm for hours.
With no scorch pad underneath.
No
need for it.
What about that other thing we like to say that people are getting tired of?
It leaves the brackish tang
Oh, you
behind.
had to say it, the brackish tang. There is no brackish tang.
No,
it's
not
just
at all.
Sweet, delicious coffee.
Right. So if our listeners want to purchase either the 6 or the 8,
yes.
you've got the 8.
I do.
Which you could wax eloquent.
I could. I could wax
hours.
on and then wax off. It's a fantastic machine, and the listener, it's incredible how many of these Mark has sold with our coupon, which is...
the coupon is ANCO.
You had to look down at your script to...
Right, I just want to make sure I get it right.
Okay.
ANCO.
Yeah, he has just sold a great number of these. We're so grateful that you, the listener, has been supporting this podcast so faithfully. So go to Racial Coffee, RATIO coffee.com, pick out your 6 or your 8, drop the coupon code in there, ANCO, and get 15% off.
And finally, this episode is brought to you by the Gold River Trading Company.
That's right.
Purveyors of excellent tea.
Why should our listeners just drink coffee after all?
Exactly. We got both sides of the equation covered
We
here.
do.
That's right. And I admit, I wasn't a huge tea guy.
Is this a confessional?
It is a bit of a confessional,
Okay.
right? We're getting real here.
All right.
But the tea that they sent us, their black tea and their green tea are excellent.
Yeah, the gunpowder.
The gunpowder tea, the gunpowder black, right?
I love the cacao. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Somebody yesterday said cacao.
Cacao?
They said cacao.
Sounds like a bird would say.
Yeah, cacao. Had some friends over the other night, last night in fact, one of the young ladies, classics major, and she said, I'd like to try that cacao. It was she who said it. I'd love to try that cacao tea that I've heard about on the podcast.
Yeah.
So we brewed her up a batch, and it's chocolatey, and it's very refreshing.
Yes, I've never tasted a tea like it.
It's fantastic.
Right, yeah. It bridges that liminal space between your traditional tea and your hot chocolate.
Yeah.
Right.
So, listener, if you would like to try some Gold River Trading Company delicious tea, you need to go to goldriverco.com, make your selections, put them into your little basket, and then what's the coupon code, Jeff?
ANTEA, ANTE.
So you want them to up the ante,
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Ante up.
All right.
That's right.
Check it out. All right, now as we get back into it this afternoon, Ken, we're gonna change gears a little bit and move away from the Catacomb of San Sebastian and San Callisto, and take a look at those of San Sebastian.
Dave, before we do that, can I tell one story?
Of course.
About the Catacombs of San Callisto. So I was in Rome for a summer study back in 2006, and my wife was with me.
This is the Trajan's Column episode?
It was at the American Academy, and was studying Trajan's Column. Whose ashes were buried inside the city walls.
Trajan's ashes?
Yes, he was. Yes, it was like he
the pomerium.
Right, but that's what the story's about. And so we had a free day, and I asked back my wife, "What do you want to do?" And she said, "I've always wanted to see the catacombs."
Right.
And so we went to the San Callisto catacombs, and this is the middle of summer, so there was a huge crowd, and you get your ticket and you wait for your language to be called, right? And this guy, this priest came to lead us through, and he was a Brit.
Oh.
And he was on a mission to get us through that catacombs as quickly as possible. And so we're flying through it. I remember my favorite moment was we're in the crypt of the popes, and he's standing there, and he's just pointing. He goes, "There's a pope, 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 not a pope, 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 pope. Let's move on." And so Beck still tells that story to this day.
Oh, that's funny.
But he was just pointing them out, and let's next corridor.
I'm sure he loved your American accent and standard pop culture references and so forth.
Of course,
they're always charmed by that. The Brits.
Right. So it was not a very reverent experience.
No,
it was
I can only
hustle us through.
There's a pope, not a pope.
Not a pope. Yeah. But let's talk about the catacombs of San Sebastian. So Ken, what makes these distinct or different than the catacombs we were just talking about?
Well, for one thing, they've never been lost, as the catacombs of San Callisto were. They were rediscovered in the 19th century, but San Sebastiano has been open to the public ever since Constantine built his church over these catacombs. And they also were not named San Sebastian until much later. I read in one source 7th century, another source says 9th century, it doesn't matter, but in the early Christian period, this catacomb was known as ad catacombas. That's where the term came from, and subsequently also as the Memoria Apostolorum. And this refers to the fact that, according to tradition, at least in the 4th and 5th century documents, the relics of Peter and Paul were temporarily housed at this site and not at the Vatican and the Ostian Church. So those are two distinctive things. Now, two other factors that are quite different here are that the original tombs on this site were open-air tombs above ground at the time and subsequently buried. So beautifully preserved underneath the modern church, the more modern church, are 3 2nd century mausolea, which originated as pagan tombs and were converted for Christian use at a subsequent time, and then buried. So today you have to go into the basement of the modern church in order to see these 2nd century tombs, which were constructed above ground originally. And next to them, from about the 3rd century, is a plaza, again buried at a later time, that once was open air for the purpose, according to the scholars who've studied this site, of exercising the funerary rituals, and especially the funerary banquets that would be celebrated here.
Yeah.
So there's a plaza there, you said?
There's a plaza under the modern church, directly under the nave of the church as you would visit it today.
I find that plausible.
That was
you were just itching to do.
I was trying to get that in there, and I didn't want to be rude to my friend and mentor as he's explaining all this brilliance, but I just had to.
In the middle of this plaza, which you so eloquently described, is a well that was constructed, presumably to provide water for the rituals of the funerary ceremonies. And adjacent to the plaza is something called the triclia, a architectural construction which the scholars describe as used for the purpose of these banquets, on the walls of which are over 600 graffiti naming Peter and Paul, largely naming Peter and Paul. And so there are a number of bits of evidence here. Nothing is decisive, and of course scholars argue about these matters as always. But it seems that this was a site at which the relics of Peter and Paul were at least temporarily lodged.
Do we know why they would be there?
One assertion is that the final tombs of Peter and Paul were still under construction in the 4th century, and this was a facility that was designed by Pope Damasus in the late 4th century as temporary lodging for the relics before the final deposition was made. I find that less plausible than the other, which is that in the persecutions of Valerian in the year 257 and 258, the Christian community was afraid that the relics would be stolen from the Vatican and from the Ostian Way, and secreted them away for temporary preservation in the San Sebastian catacombs. They were definitely back in the Vatican and the Ostian locations by the mid-4th century. 354, I think, is the year I read. So, despite the debate, there seems some plausibility to the assertion that for a time the relics of Peter and Paul the Apostles were here. And the catacomb came to be known only much later as the Catacomb of Sebastian.
And the story behind that is that this man, St. Sebastian, was a member of the Roman military?
He was captain of the Praetorian Guard in the reign of Diocletian, so this is late 3rd century, 280s, and allegedly was a Christian whose faith was discovered accidentally. He was he was urged to deny his faith and sacrifice the emperor, refused to do so, at which point Diocletian allegedly punished him by tying him to either a tree or a column. The column is partially preserved.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I've seen it.
At which point he was shot by archers and assumed to be dead. However, when Christians came to claim his body, it turned out that he had survived this persecution. He was allegedly healed by Saint Irene of Rome, and subsequently, and rather foolishly, confronted Diocletian a second time to rebuke him for persecuting Christians.
Right.
Yeah.
At which point Diocletian had him clubbed to death. He was buried on this site, and his tomb is now venerated in the church above. But there is a cubicle in the catacombs below, which allegedly was his original place of burial.
That always reminds me of like Odysseus shaking his fist at the Cyclops, right?
Yeah.
It's not necessary.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Is this the church? I'm trying to remember. I was there last in 2018, I think. Is this the church with the rediscovered bust that supposedly is Christ by...
Well, there's a Bernini bust of Christ, one of his late works. I don't know if it was rediscovered.
Well, I mean to say that it was recently identified as probably Bernini,
as Bernini's. Yeah,
after
that's
a few
quite
centuries
possible,
of uncertainty about who was the artist and what was it meant to represent.
It's a spectacular portrait of Christ. Yeah. This is the same church.
Right.
And now the tomb of Sebastian is in that church on the left aisle, I think, as you come in, with a portion of the column to which he was allegedly tied. So, like many of the martyr stories, this has been elaborated over the centuries.
Sure.
Sebastian is one of the most commonly shown martyrdoms in Western art, painted repeatedly, partly because of the spectacular possibilities of a man full of arrows.
You're right.
Like a porcupine.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Very interesting. So in the early iconography, is it exclusively pagan imagery? We've talked about this a little bit, but is the pagan imagery and the Christian imagery mixed pretty thoroughly?
It is in these three mausolea because they originated as pagan tombs.
Right.
In fact, the inscription of the owner of the tomb is still intact on one of them, but they were modified for reuse by Christian burials. And so in one case, in the vault of the 2nd century mausoleum, there's a Gorgon head, an apotropaic image. But subsequently, in the very same tomb, in the 3rd century, Christians were buried in there, and so we have the ichthus inscribed in a graffito, the acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior.
Right.
And we also have Christian frescoes on the walls of the same mausoleum. And in that sense, they are mixed. However, by the 3rd century, when Christians began extending these catacombs, almost exclusively Christian burials begin to appear in the 3rd century, and the pagans seem to have ceased to use this location. So we have 1st and 2nd pagan tombs in this area, but by the 3rd century, it's making a transition almost entirely to Christian use.
And when did the catacombs cease to be used, as we start to wind down here this afternoon, as burial places for the Christians of the city of Rome?
In the 5th and 6th centuries, they largely ceased to be used for 2 reasons. One was, as I mentioned earlier, the popes began moving relics into the city, and especially into above-ground churches in the city, where the relics began to be essential components of Roman Catholic architecture. A proper Mass, for example, must be said on a table that has relics embedded in them. And so beginning in the 5th and 6th century, with the translation of all these relics into the city, the catacombs ceased to be of any use. In addition, beginning with Constantine, basilicas were constructed over many of these cemeteries as cemetery basilicas, and at that point, burials in the floor of the church became a very common new mode of burial. So new Christian burials tended to be close to the sites of important tombs. Burial ad martyres or ad apostolos, for example, was highly favored. The closer you could be buried to a famous saint or to an apostle.
Just like my office used to be right next door to yours.
Exactly, yes.
It's pretty much the same thing.
It's pretty much exactly the same. Comparing Minora to Major.
Yeah.
So it was by the 5th or 6th centuries that the catacombs ceased to be used for new burials.
Now, you couldn't be buried in there now, right? I mean, they're completely closed off to any kind of burial or contemporary use, and entirely holy sites for the Roman Church. And
they are all controlled by the Pontifical Institute of Christian Archaeology, or Sacred Archaeology as they call it. I believe there are a few burials. For example, in one of the basilicas that still stands above the Catacombs of San Callisto is buried De Rossi, the 19th century discoverer of this catacomb. His tomb is in the very place where you get the orientation lecture before you go down.
I remember that spot.
And I have observed groups of Catholics celebrating Mass in some of the chambers as visitors to the catacombs, but whether they're celebrating Mass for any contemporary burials, I don't know. My guess is that very few modern burials are in this area.
Yeah. No. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I could try to kind of connect this, this practice of, the bones of the saints kind of sanctifying the place, having any kind of pagan corollary. You don't find, the Greco-Roman temples built on those sites with that in mind. But there are, those stories about. The prophecies about who will get the bones of Oedipus and who will get the bones of Theseus. There's a similar kind of idea there, isn't there?
There is, yeah. So the hero's grave, in general, was regarded as having spiritual power in the immediate location.
Yeah.
So Oedipus's burial site in Athens, for example, was thought to convey spiritual power somehow to Athens. And in the play Oedipus
Colonus, right?
Colonus, you have the relics of Oedipus deliberately being welcomed into Athens as having some potency.
Right.
Similarly, Cimon in the 5th century went all the way to the island of Skyros, excavated a gigantic skeleton, and brought it back to Athens as the bones of Theseus.
Right.
And
it's probably a mastodon or something.
Well, who knows what
serious.
it was.
Really?
That is one of the scientific explanations. That if a mastodon or a mammoth is found in situ, is that a good phrase there?
Yes.
All right.
Very excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent Latin.
It can resemble a human skeleton, and especially the mastodon's skull. this is not so much for Theseus, but for the Cyclops, right? There's a large hole right in the center of this circular disc-shaped skull where there may have been an eye, right? Cyclops, that's one of the theories.
So shrines for heroes' burials certainly have importance in classical tradition. And the shrines of imperial burials, of course, have importance for the Roman world.
Right.
This is a little bit different, although the role of the saint and the cult of his relics bear some similarity to pagan rituals about physical remains of heroic figures.
Right.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I mean, this is a little bit kind of off topic. I just wanted Ken's opinion on this. The history of relics and kind of the myths of relics is something that fascinates me. Do you have an opinion on like the authenticity of the relics of Peter in the Vatican or the relics of Paul in outside the walls?
Or we could say the head of St. Andrew, right, at Patras.
Right.
That we saw together.
Yeah.
Did you kiss the icon?
I know I didn't. It was behind glass. You and I were there together.
Actually,
right?
you can kiss the top of the reliquary.
Maybe next time.
Yeah. Okay.
But if you were just to kind of give a quick hot take on that.
I'm inclined to think that some of these places, some of these shrines, some of these monuments have a historical foundation. What you mentioned earlier, the Tropaea of Peter and Paul, especially the one at the Vatican, can be documented by Gaius, who is recorded in Eusebius as saying that such a monument existed by about the year 160.
Yeah.
It's not impossible that the memory of Christians for Peter's place of burial could have survived from 60 AD to 160 AD. This is not impossible at all.
No.
Yeah.
And indeed, like the tradition claims, he was buried in a public cemetery, a cemetery of mixed pagan and Christian burials. His tomb was venerated at a very early stage. When excavations were done there, however, we've been to the Scavi together, and when excavations were done there in the 50s, all they found was 2 burials under the niche that was supposedly the marker of his grave, and neither of those burials was that of a 60-year-old person or a male. Subsequently, however, they did find in a repository in the left wall of this niche some fragments of bones that were attributed to an elderly male of heavy build.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And those relics have been displayed on occasion by Pope Benedict and more recently by Pope
Francis.
On June 29, which is the feast day of Peter and Paul. What they amount to are tiny fragments of tibias and finger bones, maybe 8 of them altogether, which could conceivably be relics of an older man buried in a special place at a special time. So I don't say it's impossible. There's no way of proving it, of course.
Right.
And so these are matters of faith more than they are of archaeology.
Yeah. But to call back to an earlier part of the episode, plausible, right?
Plausible, right, man.
Plausible.
Twice? Really?
Oh, come on. So we're on the downslope here, aren't we, Jeff?
We are, yep.
About to wrap things up. Did we want to go through the catacomb lightning round? Or should we save that for another episode?
We can save that for another episode.
So the catacomb lightning round there's a long list of names of catacombs, and we were just going to ask Ken if he has visited any of these, if he's seen them, if they're accessible, like Domitilla, Comedilla, Generosa.
I've been to 6 of them.
Oh, okay. 6.
And 3 of them are regularly open to visitors today.
Okay.
I don't know how the pandemic has affected it, but you can go to catacombida.roma, and you will find a Vatican site that gives you all the information about those that are open, their addresses, and so on.
Okay.
Maybe we could end with this. So, Ken, if somebody going to Rome, having gone through San Callisto, San Sebastiano, if you were to say, all right, you've got time to check out one more, where would you send them?
One more?
Yep.
Domitilla, which is right next to Callisto.
Okay, so you can
Callisto and Sebastiano are both on the Via Appia, just south of Rome, 2 miles.
Ways out of town.
And just a bit to their west is the Catacomb of Domitilla.
Okay.
Beautiful place, very beautiful. And unlike the other 2, it has a basilica, funerary basilica that was constructed as part of the Catacomb complex in its later stages. So you can meet in a large basilical form and then move off into the tunnels.
Yeah.
Well, if we have Ken back for a third episode,
Yes, which we will.
yes, we have to talk about a very fascinating subject, which is the transition from a Roman civil building, the Basilica, to a church.
Yes.
Which is, I've always found that fascinating. I first learned that from Ken, like many things.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But we're up against it.
We got to get out of here, don't we?
We got to get out of here, yep. Before we go, Dave, you want to talk a bit about the Moss method?
I do. If you want to study Greek, if you want to go from neophyte to...
erudite.
Yes, I have just the program for you. Go to mossmethod.com, and for $2.99, we're offering a special right now. You can purchase it at the stated price.
Am I supposed to say something there?
No, I'm just saying. Okay. The special thing is there's no discount. Just purchase it at the stated price. Right. Come on, it's $299. You can't get into Disney World for that,
That's true.
I don't think.
It's true enough.
And this is so much more entertaining than Disney. I take you through all the steps, alphabet. You got 40 lessons, 40 video lectures, quizzes, exams, and perhaps the best feature, I don't know, is you get constant access to my expertise. All the Greek that I have learned in the last 30 years of studying and teaching, much of which I learned from this man right here, I can impart to you, hopefully. So, mossmethod.com.
And another piece of goodness, you've outsourced a lot of this to a bunch of flunkies.
No, there are no flankies involved.
Not one
I do
flunky?
this all myself.
Okay.
Just this morning, we had Moss Method office hours. We had a young man from New York. We had a very famous scholar from here in the state of Michigan join us. We had a young man from Alabama, and another individual. Boy, I'm going to regret forgetting this person. But we got together. We read through Mark chapter 2. And sometimes we look at Homer, sometimes Plato, a little bit of Sophocles occasionally. Really anything you want. We have the weekly Moss Method office hours.
It's global.
It's global.
That's awesome.
People from all over.
Excellent. All right, so we got, as always, some people to thank.
Yes,
Thanks
we do.
to Mishka, our engineer, for stitching all of this madness together.
Right.
Ken and Scott for the great music that you hear throughout the episode.
We got Agricola in the studio here running
in the house. Yep.
The videography and the lights and all of that, making sure the I don't know, is there a key grip?
We got at least
a boom,
a gaffer, two gaffers.
A gaffer's a person, is that right?
I think that's right.
Okay,
that's right.
So George oversees all of that and makes sure that it turns out like it's supposed to. I remember the guy's name.
Yeah.
Jay from Kansas.
That's the one.
Yeah, I didn't want to forget Jay because I know he's listening.
Is it Jayhawk?
Yeah, he's a Jayhawk.
It's a Jayhawk. Perfect. Hey, so if you want to drop us a note, if you want a shout out, if you want to be like Daniel and give us some great ideas for future episodes,
which if I may say, he put in the subject heading. Hate mail, more hate mail.
He did. Well, he's got
He's a little facetious.
He's got an edge to him.
Yeah,
right?
he definitely does.
We'll deal
but
with
send
him
it
later.
to us. Contact us.
Yep.
Send your hate mail to Jeff at adnauseam.com. Don't forget the V.
That's right. Or you send your hate mail to Dave at adnauseam.com. Again, don't forget the V.
That's right.
Dave, what are we doing next week?
Next week, you ready? This is the first time you've heard this.
Yes.
We are going to cover a book by a very famous Renaissance scholar.
Yes.
A woman named Erica Rummel.
Okay.
And the book is Erasmus as a Translator of the Classics.
Interesting.
There's some absolute gems in there, and it should be quite interesting.
So we're zipping forward in time.
Yeah, we're going to go way ahead.
All
We're going
right.
to skip from the 3rd century, 4th century AD, all the way up into the 16th, and take a good look at Erasmus and the Renaissance.
Excellent. And Dave, you have our gustatory parting shot today.
I do. This comes from the famous 19th century French author Victor Hugo, a man who read the classics as a child. And it's from his famous novel Les Miserables. Is that how it goes?
That's right on.
All right.
Excellent.
And he says, quote, "A person may not want any more of his cake, but that is no reason for giving it away."
Words to live by.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks.